So if you're tuning in from Smith River Country, sorry you're up there in Mordor. No, it's tough. Hopefully we can give you some info. We got some good info to share this morning. So we're going to talk today about aviation. We're going to talk about big box firefighting. We're going to talk about the fire behavior the last couple of days. I'm just going to start here with the Perch Fire. This is right above Orleans. It's burning in the footprint of the Somes Fire, which is 2006. And over here we've got the Butler Fire. And there's been some construction done, some line construction over here, little bits and pieces. Pretty much the thinking has been that this fire is probably going to burn the same footprint as the Somes Fire. And so we'll pull up some more detailed maps from the operations of what's going on here. Right now, there's not a lot of heat on it. I saw a good picture this morning from my friend Vicki Preston from the fire camp in Orleans down here looking up at the fire, and you can see there's scattered smoke all over this whole kind of basin, and definitely it's got the potential if the smoke lifts out and we've got hot, dry weather and circulation, there's a lot of potential for this fire to get up and go. Right now, it's kind of taking a little nap. And that's kind of the story up and down the Klamath. I talked to a good friend yesterday in T-Bar, which is kind of right out in here. And he said, everyone's catching a breath. It was kind of cool. Things felt kind of calm. I'm just going to turn on the latest perimeters we have, which are more detailed. So here around Cottage Grove, Canyon Fire, the Elliott Fire, continuing to spread. Not a big picture strategy on these fires. I think there's kind of this acceptance that the Canyon Fire is likely just gonna get really big up in here, but don't have great intel on what's happening with the kind of subdued fire behavior right now. Firefighters are making a lot of progress on these fires as they're laying down, but the terrain here of Canyon doesn't lend itself to going direct and just putting it out, and it's not great access. It's really steep, and you're really not going to drop a hand crew down this ridge here, right up canyon of a active forest fire, most likely. One thing where there is quite a bit of progress is being made here on the U-fish. I think that this fire, the perimeter isn't real accurate as right now, but on the ops maps, they've got dozer line opened up pretty much all the way around, and then they've got some planned line. And when we look at our fire history, those are lines that were put in McCash in 2021, so pretty easy to open back up. And one thing we're seeing a lot in a lot of this fire country is that when we rehab fire lines, a lot of times in the past they drag logs all over them, and people are getting wise to the fact like, hey, we're going to need to use this fire line in the next year or two or three, so let's not completely try to obliterate it. Let's water bar it and make sure it's not bleeding erosion into the creeks, but these strategic places on the landscape, there's kind of more of an emphasis now on, hey, let's maintain those corridors so we can open them back up in the next fire, and also potentially let's do fire thinning. We did a project out here in the Klamath about 10 years ago where we helped map all the historic dozer lines from all the past fires. And then that's actually getting used a lot on these fires now. Managers coming in to see a fire can say, hey, where are the past lines and what can we do? What can we open up easily? And so over here on the Klamath, there's definitely been an emphasis on thinning and kind of forced health projects along those strategic lines, just so you don't have a whole bunch of snags right along the dozer line that could fall down and carry fire across the line or fall down on firefighters. So like we said last couple of days, the Klamath is kind of leading the way in some of the strategic thinking about how to think about future fire management. Okay, so here's an ops overview map of the Happy Camp complex. On here we can see on the head fire that there's fire line up Mill Creek here. The fire was real active along this edge where it came over the top of the hill towards Mill Creek, and they're showing that as contained now. We've got dozer line up towards the McKinney fire, and you can see on this map they've got all the old dozer line. There's dozer line out that they've opened up here from McKinney last year, contingency line. And so this fire the head hasn't spread much with all this rain. And so we're starting to see, it's taken a while, but we're starting to see a lot more black line on the map where these fires of Scott and Gold are now kind of contained on the Scott Valley side of things. And then they've got roads prepped where they're backing down here along the Scott River Road. So same over here on U-Fish, what we were just talking about. You can see these dozer lines that they've opened up out this ridge. You can also just see all the dozer line on it, all the ridges out here. And so kind of what this dozer line map, historic dozer line map tells you is that kind of every ridge you can drive a bulldozer on in the Klamath has had a bulldozer on it. And one of the things that the locals are trying to kind of help steer over here is that some of these ridges haven't held in the past because of, fire behavior, or because of, maybe there's a gap in the middle of this ridge where there's a rock outcrop that you can't get a dozer through. Just because a line shows up on a map as a place that the dozer has been in the past doesn't mean that it's going to stop the fire this time. So as we've been talking about, that local input is really important, and the Klamath has kind of got a good model of how the locals can kind of interface with the command teams, because it's not easy to kind of get the ear of the IC, or to kind of convince, if you don't have a rapport already, to convince the operations guys that you actually know what you're talking about. Like we said, you can see that there's no dozer line that's new showing up for these fires here at Cottage Grove on the ops maps. You see that there's an old dozer line here. It's interesting also when we turn on old dozer lines and look at the fires and see, hey, that dozer line goes right through the middle of the fire because it didn't work. So don't have a lot of intel on Perch. Don't have a lot of intel down here on the Mosquito or Bluff. The Blue 2 fire is not being staffed. It's being left to burn. Mosquito is being staffed, and they've got a few crews now, and they are. This fire really hasn't spread that much. But I think we'll go here to the main attraction and talk about Smith River Complex. So there's been a lot of problems with the infrared planes that fly these fires, and we did just get a perimeter this morning at about 6:30 for this fire. They've just been having some real problems with their equipment. We want to do a story on that. So if you have any intel on what's going on with the NIROPS program, we'd like to hear. We got a call into their national coordinator. But basically, they fly these planes over the fires, usually around midnight, and they've got 2 planes that fly the whole West Coast in the past. They capture perimeter sometime between 9 and 2, and then that gets uploaded to a server, and an interpreter looks over the data, and they create these polygons. And so they're having problems. And that's hard for the fire command teams, because with all this smoke and everything, if you can't get a recon flight during the day, IR is often one of the only things that works for us to really know exactly where the fire is. And you can't really fight the fire very well out in some of this country if you just don't know where it is. So there's kind of a general state of decline in the course of my career of the capacity of the Forest Service to fight fire. And I'm not saying that to throw stones. It's just kind of a stated fact that they've lost a ton of expertise, and the fires have gotten bigger and more complex, and it's kind of an unwinnable task to expect them to put out these huge fires once they get going and have escaped initial attack. And that we're seeing that kind of all across the board. We're seeing that in the fact that we can't get perimeters for days. We're seeing that in the fact that it takes them a week to order specific types of equipment that are useful for fire camp support. There's just a lot of kind of general dysfunction in the overall kind of structure of the entire kind of federal fire program, and we see that expressed during these crises when we can't get maps. Just kind of one small part of the puzzle, but every single part of the puzzle is strained by kind of diminishing capacity, people leaving, and also just generational loss of highly skilled people that have been running these programs for 40 years who leave, and we haven't done a great job of training a new generation, or a new generation just doesn't want to work for the Forest Service. I'm sorry if you're sitting in Gasky waiting for me to finish my monologue here. Some comments here about, we saw a bunch of big planes yesterday. Yesterday, there was a bunch of air tanker work. There's heavy air tanker drops here on the ridge kind of between Gasky and Darlingtonia. There's a dozer line that's been put in kind of from the highway or from the power line corridor up this ridge and down again to kind of flank Gasky, and that got painted heavily with retardant. And then out here, this ridgeline is beginning to be painted retardant. So the most interesting thing we have to report, really, on this fire is that they finally published on their ops map kind of the plan, the what we call the PACE, primary, alternate, contingency, and I'm not sure what E stands for, emergency. I'm not sure, but this blue box here is kind of the primary plan of where this fire is going to get stopped. And it's 120,000 acres. It's about 80,000 acres north of 199. And that doesn't really include this fire here. There's a different box for how they think they're going to wrap in the hurdy-gurdy. Also, yesterday there's some pretty interesting maps that the team put out on past fires and all the fire line from the past fires. But I just kind of want to go through that box real quick. So just the report as far as imminent threat to Gasky, Darlingtonia, is the fire over the past 24 hours didn't spread a lot. We had this big push the night before last, 3.5 miles down canyon. And yesterday it spread, more like, a quarter to half a mile. And it kind of squirted out in various places here. And I'm not sure exactly what the shape is about. The white line here shows 24 hours of fire growth. So from last night at about 2 a.m. to the night before at about midnight is the white line to this new line. So you can see, little bits of heat happening out ahead of the Kelly fire. Hardly any spread at all on the Coon fire, which ran this fire made kind of a slope-driven run yesterday afternoon probably. Squirted up the hill. But the white line shows this fire didn't move that much. Hurdy-gurdy really didn't move much at all. And the hurdy-gurdy is backed up against a recent fire, so is unlikely to really spread out to the east. So just coming back to this box, though, the box does have kind of a donut hole cut out here. Like they're not planning to let this kind of 99 Gasky structures. This is all kind of ringed with dozer line, and the plan is not to let that burn. And that's really a huge focus on this fire, is structure protection. But the box basically is up the 305 road here. There's a spot up here where this fire has slopped over the 305, but it didn't look like it had a lot of spread. Didn't show any spread in the last 24 hours on that. So up the 305, then up, I don't know what this ridge is. Out here, it's kind of, they have a gap in the line. I think they don't really know exactly what direction that's going to go. And then carries out this ridge system back down into the 316 road. And then one problem is that their primary line here has already been burned over. So going to have to go to plan B out here. And there's not a lot of great options now that it's crossed kind of over that divide. The next line out is going to be maybe to tie it down to the bottom here and back up these ridges. But what we've been talking about is that building the big box takes a really long time. And so it's like, well, is the new box that you come out 199, go up this ridge? I mean, the fire kind of pushes your timeline. And so it's, and we tend to end up thinking on big fires in watershed scale. So it's like, okay, well, the new box is probably going to come out, another thousands of acres. So we'll keep following that and we'll update that tomorrow. But that's kind of the bad news, is just that once a fire kind of crosses, you see it made a pretty good push here on the north end of maybe, a quarter to half a mile over the last 24 hours. And once that's lost, like, it's pretty hard to catch in this ground. Once you lose a major ridge and it's into the next one, that's just a big deal. Okay, well, anyway, up here, Slater fire is a big kind of part of the equation, and that Slater in 2020 burned out into this area. And so this fire on this flank is pretty much contained. It's got a 3-year-old burn. It's not really going to move very fast in it. And so that helps in that they can focus on other places. So out here, the big concern. So, all right, north up. Here's 199. Here's the California-Oregon border. Here's the fire pushing over that ridge where they hope to hold it. no big fire history out in here, and so that's a problem fuels wise. But once you get down here to Slater, okay, that's taken care of for you. And really what we see is just that, like, things like this 2015 Bear Fire, the Slater Fire, those are these landscape scale controls that are going to affect where this fire ends up. So that's your blue line around kind of the north end of the fire. Coming down here to the south end of the fire, pretty much the box comes down to the 427 road at Hyuchi, and it heads out. And we've got down here the Coon Fire from 2015, which is going to help, and a bunch of dozer line from that fire is still on the map. So potentially, they'll open up these old dozer lines and lines that help contain the 2015 Bear Fire. They know where they are. They're on their maps. So 427 out to Bear. They kind of have to scoot out around this area because they've got the Coon Fire here. If this fire wasn't here, maybe they could tie the dozer lines from the Bear Fire back up to the 405 road, but they can't because this fire's in play. And so here they kind of they follow these road systems, and the idea is that you're going to punch dozers where you can through this country. I'd say the thing about these blue lines on the map, the primary everything, it's really easy to draw this stuff when you're sitting in the ops tent or the GIS trailer, and but when you get real about it, it's like, okay, that's 10 miles. And from here to here is 8 miles. So you start talking about, having, like, we zoom out on this whole thing, this box that they want to build, and we break out our ruler and just go really coarse. 120,000 acres it's a huge chunk. So it's 60 miles to get around that. Dozers can make a lot of line in a hurry. A Type 1 hand crew in ground that's not super difficult can maybe cut, 4,000 feet, 5,000 feet of line a day. They like using roads. They're going to prep a lot of these roads. Actually getting this all prepped, and then, a lot of this line's not going to hold unless you fire it. And then once you fire it, you've got to, snag the roads, and you've got to patrol and mop up that edge, or, somewhere out in the middle of nowhere here, a snag can catch on fire and throw embers over the line. So unless you have time to prep, fire, hold, and mop up all this line, it's really hard to pull off. And meantime, you've got a fire that, on a day that it wakes up, can run 3 or 4 miles. So that's why you have contingency line. I haven't digitized the kind of alternate or contingency lines yet, but that's the story of big box firefighting. It takes a long time to get the prep done. You've got to make sure that you put your line in a place where you have time to actually do the prep. So it's like, and also, mid-slope roads are a tough place to hold fire. This is steep ground, and if you've got fire above you on a mid-slope road, it can roll down. And if you have a fire that comes screaming up out of here with a north wind, it's unlikely that a little kind of ridge top fire line's going to hold unless you've already established a bunch of depth to your line with firing operations. So we wanted to talk about aviation today. There's been a lot of questions about, like, how come they're not using the tankers more? How come they're using them on this area but not on another one? And we wanted to talk a little bit about that. My perspective, I guess, on aircraft is changed over time. The air tech people that are kind of running the air show are, they're really skilled. They're really experienced, and they're really not super game on wasting retardant or risking pilots for pointless missions. There's definitely kind of a narrative out there that some of these drops are just for show. And sometimes that's true, but for the most part, the aviation people are really on it. So we look at where they painted this ridge here at Gasky. They painted the ridge here, so I'll jump back in the map. So got our heat satellites here. We got Gasky, Darlingtonia, and these green lines are places that we've gathered that retardant was dropped yesterday. And there's kind of a lot of things that happen on fires that are like, we had to try something. And no one wants to get criticized. No one wants to have fire burn Gasky and then have people say like, hey, how come you guys didn't fly retardant yesterday? The air was clear. You had planes available. And so I would say there's definitely a little bit of performative action that happens. No one wants to leave tools in a toolbox. No one wants anyone to be able to say they didn't try everything they had to stop the fire. But sometimes the geography just doesn't lend itself to aircraft being effective. Aircraft are only really effective at slowing the fire down. They don't stop the fire. And so once you have a retardant line, if it holds the fire up, either it's buying you time to get crews in, but fires can spot over retardant. They can burn underneath it if the fuels are dry. And so retardant's just kind of, it cools off the fire. It gives you a chance to either slow the fire down so you have time to get dozers in or hand crews in. But even after the fire burns up to retardant line, you still need someone to go in there and kind of cut a line and cold trail, look for heat. So they're going to do what they can here. They're going to, everything that can be done to keep the fire out of Gasky. So they painted this ridge. But the fire is kind of spreading down this canyon. And we can't drop retardant in creeks. And so our options are pretty limited as to, we can't just come in here and paint this whole area with retardant and expect it to hold, because snags torch up inside the fire and they loft embers. And unless you can kind of get in there and fall snags and cut a fire line, it's really hard to stop the fire, especially in steep terrain. So retardant that's happening right here is reinforcing this ridge top line. Maybe at some point they're going to burn off this if they have favorable weather to deepen that line. But that's also fraught. Putting fire on the ground is it's a real commitment, and it has to be kind of part of a coordinated effort. You don't want to come out here and start like a firing operation here and then not have the resources to have it spot over here, and then you've moved the fire forward 5 miles. So the big strategy with these big boxes is often we do a ton of prep and then we do firing operations. Because we don't want the fire to we don't want to build a line here and then walk away and have our firefighters somewhere else and then have the fire come blast out of here, 5 days from now and have no one there to stop it. So often what happens, you put in the line, you fire it, it burns back down this mountain, and now you've got this black line. Even if this doesn't necessarily burn, you might then have a nice half-mile buffer of black. So pre-treating with retardant is kind of a hot topic, I'd say, among fire managers. Does it work? Is it an effective use of aircraft? Is it effective use of money? Another thing that's going on here is just that with all the smoke that sits into these fires, with the winds coming from the west, the western flank of the fire is kind of the first to have the smoke lift out. And so if there's a time during the day that you're going to be able to get clear enough air to use air tankers, oftentimes it's going to be on that upwind side of the fire. So we might not get an opportunity to fly tankers on the east side of this fire for weeks if there's an inversion and there's west winds that blow the inversion out, but still pack that smoke out to the east side of the fire. So all that's just to say that aircraft are extremely effective on initial attack. If you have a 10-acre fire and you hit it with 10,000 gallons of retardant, usually that's going to make the difference and stop the fire. But when you've got a 40,000-acre fire, you can slow the fire down, but, we could paint this whole ridge here and it doesn't stop all this other fire that's out here from being a problem, and it doesn't stop fires from spotting over the line. On big fires like the Dixie Fire, we've seen spotting over a mile. And so generally we don't see a lot of real good kind of effective outcomes as far as stopping the fire from retardant kind of on these major campaign fires. It has to be done in concert with firing operations and, a larger strategy. So hopefully, there is dozer line here on this ridge. We may see some firing operations as the fire pushes in closer to kind of bring the fire to the line on our terms. But retardant doesn't put out big fires. It can be effective. Sometimes, absolutely yes, fire retardant is performative. We want to be able to say we did everything we could. But coming back over here to the Lost Fire over here by Oric, you can see firing going on this fire as well. There's kind of this trail here. I don't know if it's a road or it's a dozer line now, but they've been carrying fire out along this ridge, and they've got other lines down through here. And so, Lost is, the goal here is definitely to kind of wrap it. It's got a lot of line, and now they're in the process of firing that out. So the whole thing with firing operations is it's all about getting a weather window, and you don't necessarily want to start, a firing operation like this if you've got a forecast. Here's the north. If you got a forecast for north winds, you probably aren't going to come out and light a whole bunch of fire in a place where it can run downwind. But if you've got southeasterly or southerly wind, you can fire this and have the favorable winds to carry it back into the unit. So all this stuff, we've got meteorologists out on these fires. We've got fire behavior analysts, and all this planning, all this kind of like long range planning takes place in this kind of team environment of like, okay, what's the weather forecast for the next 4 days? Got strong westerlies. Okay, well, let's fire the west side of the fire and have it go back into itself. All that helps a lot, but you're still kind of, like we said the other day, you end up with these kind of targets of opportunity. It's like, if we've got prep dozer line here, we might have to wait for a good westerly to fire that. And I'd say one thing that's kind of interesting about firing in this country is there's been a lot of kind of awareness among the locals of the destructive impact of firing operations, especially in, like, say, 2008. Firing is what contains these big fires. But if you come out here, this fire has, it's 1,000 acres, and it's barely spread in the last 5 days. These fires are burning in kind of fine fuels in the Biscuit fire footprint. They're really not moving that much. So, if you come out here and decide like, well, we're going to fire this whole box to contain this fire, and then you get a strong wind that pushes the fire out into here, this fire might not ever have got there. And so it's pretty fraught putting all this fire in the landscape. But we've got some videos on the lookout about firing operations on the Dixie Fire, where a huge amount of the acreage burned on the Dixie Fire was burned by firing operations. And that's not to say that much land would have burned or wouldn't have burned without firing, but it's to say that once you put fire on the ground, you own it. So like we were saying earlier, this fire is spreading this way. If you come out and put fire on the ground out here and then lose it under a strong north wind, you've just advanced the whole fire 3 or 4 miles ahead of where it was anyway. And one thing that happens with these wind events, like we saw the other night, is that we had a strong kind of northeast push, and this fire ran 3.5 miles. So a wind event gives you kind of a given engagement or a given effect. Maybe a wind event is going to move the fire 4 miles. So if you do a firing operation 4 miles ahead of the fire, and then you get a wind event and your firing operation burns 4 miles, there's decent odds that the fire you were trying to stop wasn't even going to get there on that wind event. So this is all just kind of part of the chess game that these folks are having to play now. Even though these fires were kind of started by God, once you start putting fire on the ground, you own it. I'd say it's easy not to envy the folks that have to make those calls. I think it's also good to ask the question of the public policy, right? Like on the Dixie Fire, we had a firing operation that was kind of supposed to save Quincy and the Highway 89-70 corridor from the fire, but that firing operation burned 50,000 acres of some of the only east side kind of pine forest that was left on that district. And so it kind of begs the question, like, is it worth having a town in the forest if there's no forest? Somehow, as a society, we made the call at some point that it was worth it to burn 50,000 acres of timber to save the community. No one wants to burn down towns. But what's happening out here is that the incident command team is working for the forest supervisor, and the forest supervisor has kind of their own political pressures. And then we're trying to deal with these kind of landscape scale phenomenon that are beyond our real control. And so I think in the long term, one hope with the lookout is that we get people talking about like, well, what are the trade-offs? Like we're trying to keep fire out of this landscape that's had an enormous amount of fire. And these teams are kind of trying to do their best in this situation, but you can see that the outcome often is that the fire burns till it rains. So I think acknowledging the limits faced by the folks that are trying to control these fires is good, and also acknowledging that the best thing we can do to deal with fires like this is to fireproof towns like Gasky, Hyuchi. Like if we're going to live deep in the forest, we need to be burning and thinning and really hardening our communities so that we don't have to live in as much fear. I'm going to read a few comments. Dennis Burns' famous quote from Dixie was, "Well, we hope it holds, but it went through Greenville." If you don't know who he is, I think there's actually even like a Dennis Burns Facebook fan page. He's a fire behavior analyst and, like Ryan says, excellent communicator, good storyteller. Like I said, a lot of great folks working on these teams. It's not their fault that we kept fire off this. Well, it is kind of their fault that we kept fire off this landscape for 100 years because they're the ones that have helped do it. But folks are, they've got some really smart people out there that are trying their best to kind of do the impossible on these fires. And so you can't really blame them for failing at unwinnable tasks. And what I say on this show is it's not intended to, armchair quarterback the ops folks. I got some friends that are ops chiefs, and they're all really freaking smart, and they've all been schooled by the past decade of insane fire in California. They do what they can, and they have to make insanely difficult calls. Much respect to the ops folks. I'm hoping that with the Lookout, we can kind of just tell stories that they can't tell because of their kind of chokehold the PIO and all those other folks keep on the narrative, right? So that's why you're here, right, for different narrative.